Okay, in this video I want to give a defense of the Christian idea of hell, which is a huge objection to our faith, and I think it may be the most difficult aspect of our faith. For me personally, it certainly is. I've kind of agonized thinking about this doctrine at various points in my life. It's an extremely painful thing to consider, and it has lots of emotions for us. Some of that is because of caricatures. I think hell is often misunderstood. We'll talk about that. But I think even apart from the caricatures, it's a very difficult doctrine. But I want to explain one way you could think about it that could make sense. One way somebody could look at this that actually is reasonable. And the way I put it is this: if you believe in a world in which there's two things, God and choice, it's difficult to say how hell couldn't be a possibility. And I want to just unpack both of those with some C.S. Lewis quotes here, and then I'll respond to an objection. So if you believe in a world with God, it's difficult to see how hell wouldn't be a possibility because God is understood to be the source of all goodness. So just as if you turn off all the lights, you'd say, well, what could it be but darkness? Similarly, if a created thing is finally severed from God and separated from God, which is one way to understand hell, what could it be other than hell? And the reason for this is because God, whether we realize it or not, whether we're consciously aware of this dependence or not, every good thing we ever get comes from God, just as much as a letter or a present or a gift comes from the person who sends it to you. C.S. Lewis put it like this: to be God, to be like God and share his goodness and creaturely response, to be miserable. These are the only three alternatives. If we will not learn to eat the only food that the universe grows, the only food that any possible universe ever could grow, then we must starve eternally. Now, someone might say, how could it ever be that a creature would be separated from God? And that's where the second thing comes in, and that's choice. Here's how C.S. Lewis put it: I would pay any price to be able to say truthfully, all will be saved, but my reason retorts, without their will or with it. If I say, without their will, I at once perceive a contradiction. How can the supreme voluntary act of self-surrender be involuntary? If I say with their will, my reason replies, how if they will not give in? Now, some people would ask, well, why would anyone ever not choose to be united to God? Why would anyone ever choose hell over heaven? But actually, I think if you look at our world and you look at human psychology at a smaller scale, you see the same fundamental choice every day. And this is what I think the Christian view of the afterlife, though it's so extreme, the extremes start to make sense. You know, you've got these two possibilities, not just one or not lots, and the two are infinitely far, infinitely good, infinitely bad. But that starts to make a little more sense if you think that basically the final state of every creature is either to possess God or be separated from God. And you could say, if you are separated from God, you can't just be half miserable. And if you possess God, you can't just be half joyful and happy and blessed. This, for me, is what the Christian view of the afterlife does that makes sense. It gives such dignity to our moral choices. So I think of it like there's this huge divide. There's this huge separation happening. All of reality is pulling in one of two directions, further and further apart. It's like there's an earthquake and the divide is getting wider and wider and wider. Good and evil are getting more and more separate. Good and evil are not static. Good and evil are dynamic, ever expanding categories. Evil keeps getting worse. Good keeps getting better. The divide is getting further and further. And every choice that we make is pushing in one direction or the other. And it's a very sobering thing, but it gives such dignity and significance to the moral choices that we make to think heaven and hell is simply what will result when this process is finished, and the divide is infinite and irreversible. Now, let me respond to an objection to finish. Some people think that C.S. Lewis is too soft on hell, that he, quote unquote, one of the scholarly articles on him puts it like this. It says he takes the hell out of hell. And they say, this way of thinking about hell is out of step with how the Scripture and how Christians traditionally have thought of hell. But I would say that actually, I want to defend C.S. Lewis in a couple ways. First, I think it needs to be pointed out, and this is where Lewis is helpful, that there's a caricature that many people have of hell as this place that God builds and then sends people. And it's thought of in that way without any connection to the doctrine of God. So there's no sensitivity to why hell must be the way that it is. I think that's where Lewis can be helpful to us. And there's a great passage in Surprised by Joy, his book, about that. I also want to say, I don't think that Lewis's idea of hell as a choice and as the natural trajectory of evil is at odds with thinking of hell in the more traditional categories of judgment. So C.S. Lewis takes a lot of criticism for his book, The Great Divorce, where he's talking about hell as a kind of self-exile or a choice. He talks about the doors of hell are locked from the inside, and there's the famous quote put in the mouth of George MacDonald where everybody ultimately says, either they say to God, thy will be done, or God says to them, thy will be done. And he's often criticized for this because in the scripture you do have Jesus talking about people being sent to hell. And some people think that C.S. Lewis is kind of making it not scary anymore. I would say a couple things. First is, it's possible that it's both. These things aren't necessarily incompatible. To say that on the one hand, hell is the natural, organic trajectory of evil, and at the same time, it is a judgment upon evil. You could think of it like a judge who imposes a sentence upon a criminal, and the sentence is in accord with what the criminal is already moving towards. I also want to say that C.S. Lewis's way of talking about hell isn't a total innovation. This idea of good and evil as dynamic and as kind of reaping their own result is very much a medieval idea coming out of Boethius in his book, The Consolation of Philosophy. And I'll reference an article in the description of this video where I talk a great deal more about that and give some examples. And the last thing I want to say is that it's not necessarily the case that this way of thinking about hell isn't a scary one. In fact, a lot of people find this self-exile idea of hell terrifying. Charles Williams did when he first encountered it. He was one of the other of the Inklings. Tim Keller tells a story about how his point is that we shouldn't just preach the images of hell, we should preach what those images mean. And he tells a story of meeting someone. He says, some years ago, I remember a man who said that talk about the fires of hell simply didn't scare him. It seemed too far-fetched, even silly. So I read him some lines from C.S. Lewis. Hell begins with a grumbling mood, always complaining, always blaming others. In each of us there is something growing which will be hell unless it is nipped in the bud. To my surprise, he got very quiet and said, now that scares me to death. And Keller talks about how he began to think about the trajectory his life was on. I'll just say one more thing about this. This isn't a full treatment of this, but it's just trying to offer a few reasons of why believing in the idea of hell isn't arbitrary, it isn't necessarily cruel. This actually can make some sense if you believe in God and choice. That doesn't take away all the difficulty, though. And so I'll put this final question and share just how I personally land the plane on this issue for myself. Here's a final C.S. Lewis quote. He says, in the long run, the answer to all those who object to the doctrine of hell is itself a question. What are you asking God to do? To wipe out their past sins and, at all costs, to give them a fresh start, smoothing every difficulty and offering every miraculous help? But he has done so on Calvary. To forgive them? They will not be forgiven. To leave them alone? Alas, I am afraid that this is what he does. That reference to Calvary there helps me think about this, because if you think of Jesus hanging on the cross, if you have good reasons to believe that Jesus is an accurate reflection of the heart of God, you think of Jesus saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I still don't have all of my questions answered about theology in general and this particular topic specifically, but I know what the answer cannot be. The answer cannot be that God is ungenerous or unjust because of what I know to be true of him in Jesus. And therefore, my personal choice is, although this doctrine is a weighty one that we should shed tears over, and I do. I mean, this is one of those things, if you really believe it, it really does weigh upon you. But my personal choice is that when all is said and done, at the end of the day, God will be seen to be good. And I think that's a reasonable thing to trust based upon what we have revealed about God from Jesus.